It's my great pleasure now to introduce Kari Brænne, who is an artist, who is a playwright, who is a novelist and a woman of many parts, but specifically of great interest today. She is a descendant of Peder Balke and can tell us about what it's like growing up with this extraordinary man in your background.
Thank you for inviting me all the way. Yes, there I am. That's me. For inviting me all the way from Norway to this symposium. For an artist, for an artist and a novelist from a small country where the pressure to conform can be constricting, it's always inspiring to be back to the Big Apple. I would also like to thank Norla, Norwegian Literature Abroad, who sponsored my trip. And they are also organizing a huge event in 2019 when Norway will be the guest of honor at the world's biggest book fair in Frankfurt. I had to bring my books to get that money. So here they are, if there is interest. There's also about the book fair here. Now, I need to see all the pictures that are coming. Okay. I am Peder Balke's great-great-great-granddaughter. I grew up in what we Norwegians call a furnished home. My mother always complained that she lived in a museum, though most of the stuff came from her side in the family. My mother died last year, and here is the very last thing that I swept out of her basement. It's Peder Balke's charcoal holder, which I call my magic wand. It will not change pictures, so okay. Here I am, some time ago, wearing one of the pieces in the collection, one of Balke's daughter's dresses. I'd like to share a little bit about growing up with this inheritance and the female line from Balke down to me, and also some reflections on developing as an artist in a rather sparse artistic community. Oh, wait, they're jumping fast. When my grandmother Agnes was little, well, actually, I should tell you who these people are. This is Balke's wife, now widow here. That is her daughter, Marie, her eldest daughter. That's her daughter, Emma, and that is Agnes, my grandmother. When my grandmother was little, she slept in a bed alcove. She was a child who loved to draw and paint, and she loved to play with her sister, Karin. This is my grandmother, and this is Karin. And she loved her great-grandfather's paintings. They had inherited many of the small, experimental and late paintings from him. The ones he painted from memory, from his youth, when he traveled to the north of Norway. But here's another one. In my grandmother's house, Balke's paintings were banished from the living room. Agnes's Swedish father, the state road engineer, considered Balke to be the black sheep of the family. Here he is, the Swedish road engineer. And the scandalous failure. His paintings could not be on display. So, there's the living room. So my grandmother kept as many as she could fit behind the curtains inside her alcove. And thus the northern light was hidden in darkness. But how is it that the great artist we know today was so looked down upon? As we were earlier told, he was born to poor tenant farmers and grew up in the countryside with a single mother. My mother never told me what happened to his father, but I understood that he was out of the picture pretty early. Balke was influenced by his grandfather, who traveled around painting decorations in people's home, and he learned painting from another relative later from the local sheriff, who had gotten some training in the capital. Balke did very well as a decorative painter. He earned good money and married his fiancée Karen. But to avoid getting drafted into the army, he went to the capital, Christiania. He was now 24 years old. I think he must have been a very pleasant and outgoing person, as a couple of benefactors believed enough in him to encourage him to get an art education. So he studied in Christiania, in Stockholm and Copenhagen, and he traveled around Norway huge distances on foot, drawing and getting inspiration and painting when he came back to the capital. But the background as a decorative painter was almost like the mark of the beast. A craftsman could not be a fine artist. He didn't meet the expectations of the reigning style. He painted in his own way, a rougher way, less academic and elaborate, and the critics scolded him. So he traveled more, taking paintings with him, also carrying them around, trying to get recognition outside Norway and make a living abroad. Yeah, we've seen this many times. So he had some success. He, as also was said earlier, by selling paintings to King Karl Johan in Sweden and then on the continent to people who most of all were interested in the strange and wild Nordic nature. Balke's first child, Marie, my grandmother's grandmother, was born in 1835. The family was on the move in her childhood, and I like to think that Marie grew up in a suitcase, or more specifically, this suitcase that belonged to Balke and now resides in my attic, where I believe it's having conversations about the old days with the other suitcases. But it wouldn't be true. The fact is, Balke's first travels to Europe were solo. The wife and children came along later. But maybe one of her little brothers or sisters slept in it. Over the years, Karen bore 8 children. With a steadily growing family, Balke needed a regular income. Even though he had sold paintings to nobles in Europe, the Norwegian art establishment refused to accept him. They didn't find him qualified for any of the many positions he applied for. The critics kept scolding him, and he didn't sell much at home. I read that Balke took his wife and children with him abroad in 1847, when Marie and her sister were about 11 and 12. My mother told me that they were only 9 and 8 years old when they were left at the castle Maxen outside Dresden in Germany for a few years, in the care of the childless couple Major Friedrich Anton Zerre and his wife Friederike. I don't know which is true, but the fact is, Balke was in Dresden many times, and the girls stayed at the castle for quite a while. It is also a fact that the family was struggling very hard financially at this time. I got the impression that they couldn't afford feeding all their children and certainly not give them enough stability for a continuous education. The Serre couple were wealthy benefactors of the arts, and the household Schloss Maxen was a vibrant center of art, music, literature, and philosophy. It was frequented by personalities like the German composer Robert Schumann, the painter Caspar David Friedrich, I.C. Dahl, and the Danish storyteller Hans Christian Andersen, who was there at least 15 times. In 1841, Andersen wrote in the guest book, Des Herzens Sonnenschein in Sachsen strahlt am schönsten doch in Maxen. Of all the heart's sunshine in Sachsen, it shines most beautifully in Maxen. The girls, that is my mother and my aunt, wearing the girls' dresses. The girls learned German and probably many other things that little girls of good upbringing should learn at the time. Here are my mother and her sister, yeah, in the dresses. I already said that. Sorry. And here are my daughters. So you see, it's a family tradition to pose in these dresses. I imagine that the years in the castle may have been among the best in their childhood. I imagine them sitting on Hans Christian Andersen's lap, sobbing at the sad story of the ugly duckling, or being the first ones to hear the story of the Little Mermaid. Maybe even asking the difficult questions that kids can come up with. What made the mermaid lose her voice? Things that would make the great writer rethink the story and alter it a little to make it more probable. The girls seem to have gotten quite attached to the major, and especially his wife, Frederikke. I have in my possession several letters from her to the girls that indicate her devotion and interest. She tells how much she loves them, and she calls them her little angels, and it goes on and on. So they're wonderful, these little letters. The Balke family moved to Paris and London. Balke almost, as you know, got this huge commission by the French king, but lost it to the revolution in 1848, as the king had to abdicate. When the Balke family returned to settling Christiania in 1850, the girls, now 14 and 15, contributed to the household finances by teaching English, French, and German. I have a few heirlooms from Marie. Here is one of her wedding gifts when she married a wealthy ship owner. It's her china. It takes up a lot of space in my basement, and I never dare to use it. From her, that's it. From her sister, I have this Bible. From Marie's eldest daughter, Emma, I have these little tiny stockings. They're this big. There's this comedy, which is quite silly, about a squirrel, a cat, an owl, and a fairy princess. And I have these gnomes, they're also very small, with tiny clothes. According to my mother, Emma, that's Emma here, never stopped playing even as an adult. Maybe Marie, having witnessed so much hardship growing up and seeing how her parents struggled, wanted to shelter her daughter, give her more of the aura of the castle. Sorry. Emma had 8 children, 4 who never married. They lived with her, doting on her, comforting her in her old age. One of the children who did get married was my grandmother, Agnes. She was very gifted. Only 14 years old, she got into the Royal Drawing School in Oslo, the starting point for most Norwegian artists at the time. Both Munch and her great-grandfather Balke had been there. Agnes's teacher thought that she should go to Paris to enhance her education and tried to convince Agnes's father to send her. There's one of her little drawings, or little aquarelle. Her father, the engineer, refused. It was enough with one artist in the family, the failure Balke, who despite all his efforts never got it together. It was a story better to be forgotten and not repeated. Not only had Balke's art never been recognized by the ones who understood such things. For all the engineer knew, the paintings were probably as worthless and bad as the critics had said. And even worse, Balke had been very active in the field of social justice, engaging himself in political matters, like welfare, pension for the working class, and universal suffrage. Dangerous ideas. And the building of affordable housing for the poor, which had been the greatest disaster of them all, ending with a great fire and economic ruin. So my grandmother, Agnes, didn't go to Paris. Instead, she got the job as a furniture designer. But when she married my grandfather, he thought it was a shame of a wife of his to work, as if he could not support her himself. So she quit. And while he, the foreign correspondent, covering the rise of Nazi Germany, the Royal Norwegian family's travels across the Atlantic, and organized crime, sitting in the back seat of the police car chasing Al Capone, my grandmother stayed home with her 2 little daughters. Eventually, getting quite bored and bitter, her consolation was weaving small tapestries. And as a Penelope of the Odyssey, waiting for her husband to come home, she made these, slowly putting colors together. I grew up with Balke's paintings and my grandmother's woven tapestries on the walls of my home, and my great-great-grandmother's little gnomes for Christmas. I grew up to be very proud of my artistic ancestor. I also had a talent for drawing, and my parents didn't stop me. But I did experience some of the same opposition as Balke, as I didn't seem to fit in with the recognized style in Little Norway. In 1986, when I decided to become an artist, there was no classic figurative art education in Norway, hardly any in Europe at all. Painting had gone through all of its different phases, abstract expressionism and action painting being the last ones. Painting was then declared dead. But there were still drawing classes, also at the school that my grandmother had attended. I drew and sculpted for 8 hours a day. But that didn't get me into an art academy in Norway. Figurative painting and sculpture were so out of fashion that it's almost hard to imagine today. There was nowhere to learn how to paint the classic techniques. But then I was lucky. I got into the New York Academy of Art, the Graduate School of Figurative Art, and I actually had to go to America to study Leonardo and Michelangelo. I received a full scholarship financed by Andy Warhol, who allegedly regretted that he had abandoned the pursuit of classical techniques himself. When I came back to Norway in 1990, things had gone to further extremes. First of all, you couldn't get anywhere without a Norwegian art education. Second, if you wanted to be one of the hot up-and-comings, you had 2 choices, either to make provocative or taboo-breaking work, like this, or make dry conceptual art like this. Figurative art and art appealing to or talking about normal human relations or feelings were basically considered sentimental kitsch. But at some point, a debate about the art education started. It got really heated when one well-known figurative artist said on live television, "At the Art Academy in Oslo, you won't even learn how to draw a hand." One powerful sentence, and the politicians were on the ball. In 1996, 2 new professorships were established at the Art Academy, earmarked figurative art education. And I finally got into the Norwegian Art Academy myself. I even got to show my work in respected galleries. You can see it's a very respected gallery because it's a camera up here. There's also a couple of more things here. I made a series of portraits. And they have shadows. They all have shadows, the portraits in front of them. But still, many professors at the Art Academy were against the changes. The main art history professor emphasized in lecture after lecture that the first significant work of art was this. I'm sure you know this. It's Marcel Duchamp's fountain. Nothing before this, not even the Renaissance, could be considered art. It seems insane when you think back on it. It was just crafts, stuff made by skilled hands. And if it was beautiful, it was kitsch. Anything that was a painted picture of something was a depiction, which was a shameful thing, and therefore untouchable. So most of the art history was basically banned by the art history professor. When it at one point plopped out of me that I was the great-great-great-granddaughter of Peder Balke, the response was, "How dare you say that?" There's absolutely no reason to be proud. One interesting detail is that this professor is the very same person who, a few years later, by drawing and publishing a sketch of the Prophet Muhammad as a dog, was threatened seriously. Now he also somebody tried to shoot him in Copenhagen. He now lives in hiding and under heavy police protection in Sweden. I guess he's not teaching at the Art Academy anymore. So you see, we still struggle with trends and uniformity in the arts in Norway. I could also talk about the literary scene and my leap from painting to writing novels, but that would take too much time. Anyways, it seems like uniformity is what afflicted Peder Balke. In a very small country, the voices of the well-established trendsetters become painfully loud. But out of the stubborn and original thinking comes great art and literature. Balke was different and kept doing his thing regardless of fashion and negative criticism. Though sad, for a struggling artist, it's also a consolation to look at his work. True, he had endless hardships and he got no recognition in his home country during his lifetime, but he did not bow to the critics. He did not imitate his popular colleagues. He did what he had to do, what his mind and memory and feelings told him. He kept doing it, regardless of what his contemporaries thought of it. He had integrity, and that makes great art. Not all artists can bear recognition. In fame, there are traps. The trap of expectations, of trying to please an already excited audience. The trap of repeating oneself, of stopping to evolve. Balke must have had enough belief in himself to keep going, enough loving people around him. He got his education in Christiania, Copenhagen and Stockholm, and he traveled to Germany, France and England, but he never came to America. I wonder if he ever considered emigrating, as so many other Norwegians did at the time. Had he gone, I imagine he would definitely engage himself in the abolition of slavery. But would he have enlisted, taken to arms for it? I don't think so. I think he would have snuck away, fascinated and completely in love with the American landscapes. The lush green forests of the Blue Ridge Mountains, the fantastic formations of Monument Valley, and the majestic depth of the Grand Canyon, the coastline of California or New York Harbor. He would have chased tornadoes in the Midwest. He would have taken to his brushes, not to a gun. But here he is. Here you are, great-great-grandfather, at the Metropolitan. Congratulations, old man. I hope you can see it and smile from above.